Well, excellent. I always, uh, I always say there's always going to be a quiz, Randall. When there's an economist on the agenda, I always know that there's going to be a quiz. So tonight, for just a few minutes, I'm going to be talking about investing in alternative crops, and this is a really interesting topic. This is one that we could spend a lot of time with. So hopefully, within the next 15 minutes. I can just give you a few key pieces that you can use as you think about these decisions, because this is a truly serious decision. Earl Creech and I were driving in the car one day, and we said, and I like the words he used. He says, "Are you willing to bet the farm on this decision?" And that's when you're looking at some of these alternative crops. That's a great way to put it. Are you willing to bet the farm on this? So a lot of things I'm going to talk about focus on that kind of framework on how you look at this. So when we think about these, this is kind of the way my brain works. I'm gonna approach this from, first off, let's talk about the risk of alternative crops. And anytime you analyze an investment, you got to understand there's risk associated with that investment. And so I broke these down into these key areas that I just want to spend a little bit of time with. Policy, right? Certain policies affect not only regular crops, but alternative crops, management capability, marketing, contracts / quality, prices, and infrastructure. Those are the areas that I found were most important. Now understand, this is from an economist perspective, so take that with a grain of salt. Things that I'm not going to approach or discuss, which are serious considerations that need to be understood and appreciated, are the agronomic impacts, weed suppression, these other areas that it may benefit your operation. This is purely from an economist perspective. So keep that in mind as I go through this. Now, when we talk about crops, we have to start with the basics, which are commodities. Now, commodities are something that we can easily sell, we can easily transfer. Quality is not an issue. For example, yellow number 2 corn. If I have yellow number 2 corn, I can get rid of that in just about any place. It's considered to be a commodity. So when we think about commodities, we have to understand this from a supply-demand relationship. Now, in a traditional commodity, it operates in a perfect competition type scenario where price and quantity are meet to that equilibrium price. Now, the key with that equilibrium price is that's where price equals marginal cost. So there's not really a lot of profit to be made per se. This is on a market type basis because all those commodities are so similar. Now, understand that anytime you work in a commodity, you're a price taker, and you don't have a lot of control over that. But what if we transferred to an imperfect competition? Now, in this scenario, I'm talking we're moving from a commodity framework to one of these specialized or alternative crop frameworks. Now, there's risk and rewards associated with this. Now, the first thing you notice, see if my pen works here, is that this price, right? This price went up. The price you receive for that crop went up due to you not operating in this perfect competition environment. Now, at first glance, you may say, "Oh, great! What's the downside? Price went up. I see no implications." But that's under ideal scenario. That's exactly what the market is going to demand, and so that's what the price is going to be. But understand, as with any price, right? That price may go up, that price may go down. There's a lot of fluctuations that can occur. So when we're looking at these alternative crops, we have to kind of leave aside the traditional perfect competition framework and look at it from this imperfect competition framework of understanding the economics behind these commodities. Now, when we look at these, let's start with, I think the most important thing is prices, right? As I said earlier, the prices should be higher for alternative crops. And the reason why I say that is I often use this risk and reward framework, right? It's sitting on this pendulum, and you as a producer have to be compensated for that risk, and that compensation comes from increased reward. Now, anytime we look at these specialty crops, inherently, you may have a salesman or someone tell you that there's not additional risk, but anytime you go into these specialty type markets, there's additional risk. So you better expect that you deserve additional reward. And the reason for that risk is, first off, alternative crop markets are what I call not liquid. Now, liquid markets, we can define them as having many buyers and sellers. They're well defined, and there's also futures markets. Those futures markets really facilitate these many buyers and sellers. There's hedging instruments. So it really facilitates this crop being able to be highly mobile and lots of movement that can occur. Now, keep that in mind. When we transfer to these alternative crops, one of the key issues is that there's few buyers and few sellers. Now, when there's only a few buyers, there could be an issue, and we'll get to some of that, but there's fewer buyers, and so that market is going to be less liquid. Some of these markets are poorly defined. If it's a highly specialized crop, there may be no market at all. So you have to take into consideration what is the definition of the market, how is it defined. There's no futures market, so hedging those crops is going to be more difficult. You could think about a cross hedge, which is using a traditional commodity to hedge some of that risk, but that's a little risky and takes a lot of know-how. And then finally, that gets to, oftentimes with these prices of these specialty crops, we see higher volatility, more movement, which inherently leads to more risk. So yes, in theory, these prices should be higher, but because of some of these factors, there's more risk inherent within these specialty alternative crops. Next question is infrastructure. Now, the reason why I want to talk about infrastructure is I think of a pendulum or a scale of minor adjustments and major adjustments. Now, say, for example, you're switching to a organic or a non-GMO type crop. You're still able to keep your same equipment set, right? It's just a minor change. What if we're switching crops altogether? So I like to follow Twitter, some of the ag producers on Twitter. I saw a producer that put in carrots this year, and they always posted pictures of them out tilling, but with a hand tiller, these huge plots of carrots, and that's going to be a major change. So when you think about some of these changes, think about is this going to be a minor adjustment or a major adjustment? So first question we need to address is, do you have the equipment necessary to produce this crop? One time we switched and started growing some safflower. That required that we change some of the adjustments on our combine, nothing major. But if we have to buy a whole new equipment set, that needs to be seriously considered. As we get to number two, how much do we have to invest in new machinery? Anytime we invest in new machinery, that's assets we built into our operation. How profitable are those assets going to be? Are we going to utilize them enough with this new crop? Does the reward of that new crop justify this investment? Can I store this crop? If with those few buyers or sellers, if that buyer backs out, am I able to store that crop, or do I have to figure out a way to move that crop to someone else? And this could cause some serious issues. So understanding the storage implications of that, which leads to number two. The next one is, how do I transport this crop? If I can't if my buyer backs out, if I can't store it, do I have the capacity and the equipment necessary to transport this, maybe a long distance if necessary? So that's something that you really need to consider. And as we go into this year, right, as we're watching these drought conditions, can I irrigate this crop? Do I have enough water to irrigate this crop if it's a water intensive crop? So understand those infrastructure issues as you go through this. The next one is management capability, and it falls on that same scale of major and minor, right? So is it a minor change or is it a major change? Oops, tough spelling tonight. If you're going from a low intensity to a high intensity, if I'm traditionally an alfalfa grower and I want to get into high value vegetables or industrial hemp or medicinal marijuana, whatever that's going from a low intensity to a high intensity. Do I have the expertise to manage that type of crop? Or am I getting into something that's way out of my wheelhouse? Do I have the time necessary? Now, when you think about your time, think about the concept of opportunity cost. Every moment you spend with this new crop, you may be neglecting and not being able to spend time in another area of your operation. So you have to think about your time allocation and think of that from a trade-off. Is it a good trade-off? What's that opportunity cost? And finally, we all know that finding good employees in agriculture is difficult. Do you have the right employees in place? What if you have to hire someone? Do you have the funds available to hire someone with that specific skill set? Do I need a team of workers? Those are also issues that you have to figure out as you're thinking about your management capability. Now, policy is one that's a wild card. When I think about this, certain crops are profitable under these certain policies. I think about the RFS standard, renewable fuel standards. What's that done for corn demand? Currently, we're watching biodiesel. That's really a demand driver. So these policies are really could be considered demand drivers. And so with these renewable fuel standards, that really was a demand driver for corn. Biodiesel is now becoming a demand driver for soybeans and other some of these other high value biodiesel type crops. When we think about medical marijuana, we think about the sensitivity of these crops. If that policy was taken away, what would happen to the demand for that crop? That has to be a legitimate question that you ask yourself. Is that demand, right? Is that demand subject and a function of these policies? So as you think about investing in these, ask yourself, if this policy changes, will there still be demand for my crop? And also, think about the worst case scenario. Marketing. So I talk about marketing because you have to understand with these alternative crops, they are highly quality sensitive. So you have your base price, but your buyer will either discount or give you a premium based on that quality. They are highly sensitive to the quality of that crop. So if you have issues with quality, you may see that base price, but once those discounts are taken off, there may be no difference between this alternative crop and what you could have got with your traditional crop. So you have to understand those premiums and discounts as you're working and negotiating this with whoever the buyer is. And that leads me to the next part of this, counterparty risk. So counterparty risk is one that we don't talk a lot about in agriculture, but it's definitely there, especially with these crops. When you are only dealing with one buyer, and think about the risk of them, so they're that counterparty. If they are unable to fulfill their end of the bargain, if they are unable to buy your crop, or and backs out of that contract, what happens? So you want to be dealing with a buyer, a processor, broker, whatever you want to call it, that is of good reputation, that you trust, to reduce that implication of that counterparty risk. From the opposite side, that processor, that buyer, is looking at you as a grower because of these specialty crops. There's going to be more standards that you have to adhere to. They're also evaluating the risk of you. So their counterparty risk goes both ways. So a tool that I really like that you can utilize that's straightforward and simple is simply partial budgeting. So partial budgeting is just a simple economic tool that you identify only those resources that will be changed. If I'm switching to a new crop, I'm still using the same field. And in this case, let's say we can use the same machinery. I'm simply looking at the change that may occur because of that crop. Now, when you look at these changes, you could be adding land, expanding, reducing, but in this case, right, changing management strategies, changing crops are one of those key things that you want to change. So when we look at this, these are the 4 areas that you would want to identify as we analyze this alternative crop. We want to identify, is it going to increase our income, right? Because of increased price received, is it going to increase income? Is it going to reduce or eliminate certain costs? Or is it going to increase costs, or is it going to reduce or eliminate some of our income? Now, those are 4 simple categories that you can take that and put those into. Then all we do is sum up those pluses and negatives. And if that's positive, we would say that the net financial impact from this this management, this crop change is positive, yeah, it has a positive impact, financial impact for me. If that's negative, it's a negative financial impact and may not make sense for your operation. So partial budgeting, there's a lot of tools out there, a lot of documents, but partial budgeting is a straightforward, simple way to quickly analyze and look at some of these decisions. So the key takeaways, my time's about up. You got to understand the risk and rewards of these alternative crops. You can't just look at the reward side and ignore the risk side. You have to identify if your operation is capable of growing alternative crops. This is, in business, they often do the SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. In this case, just look at your strengths and weaknesses. If you have the strengths and to take on that, then it might be something you want to continue. Then finally, partial budgeting is just a simple way to look at that and analyze that from an economic perspective.